Hello and welcome everyone. This is week 3, session 3 of the 15th semester of the massive open online course for the University of Nicosia's master's degree in digital currencies. I'm your teacher, Andreas and Antonopoulos. Welcome to the class. I hope you've been studying the material from last week. I know you've asked me many great questions, and we also have a few questions left over from week 2. And I will be answering some of those too. Now, let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay, if you're excited to learn something today. Let's get started right away. Eduardo asks, what is the difference between a public key and a Bitcoin address? Could you please explain more about the difference? Eduardo, yes, that's a great question. Really not a huge difference. A Bitcoin address is usually the hash of a public key, but not all addresses are hashes of public keys. Addresses represent a fingerprint of a specific destination. The most common type of address is in fact the hash of a public key. And so that allows you to send to a recipient. The recipient can present their public key as part of spending the transaction, and the system can verify that that is the correct public key by hashing it and comparing it to the Bitcoin address. So the Bitcoin address is a hash. Now, some Bitcoin addresses are not hashes of public keys. Instead, they're hashes of more complex things, multi-sig addresses or more complex scripts. So a Bitcoin address is an abstraction. It is a hash of a spending condition. The most common spending condition is present a signature that matches a valid public key whose hash is this. But the spending condition might also be present 2 signatures for 2 public keys in a multi-sig scheme whose hash is this. Again, that's the address, is the hash. You can encode any number of complex scripts as a hash and use that as a Bitcoin address. And different Bitcoin address formats represent different things. A Bitcoin address that starts with a 1, also known as a legacy address, is a straightforward hash of a public key. There is an element of security there because you cannot reverse the hash. So you don't know what the public key is until someone spends from that Bitcoin address. And if you're not reusing addresses, then you have an extra layer of security. A Bitcoin address that starts with a 3 could be a script that represents a public key, but most often it is a more complex script, probably a multi-sig or something like that. And native SegWit or new style addresses start with BC1, and BC1 addresses, depending on their length, can either be a public key, also known a pay-to-witness public key hash, or they can be a script. So again, an address can be both. Let's hope that answered that question. Jennifer has a similar question. Will the same private key generate the same hashing public key, the same Bitcoin address, and the same signature? A private key will generate a single corresponding public key. One private key, one public key. The transformation from private key to public key, which is an elliptic curve transformation, produces a public key that corresponds directly to the private key. So that's a one-to-one correspondence. The public key is then hashed, which produces an address. Again, that's a one-to-one correspondence. So one private key, one public key, one address. Now you can encode that address in a number of different formats, but effectively it's just the same address encoded differently. When it comes to signatures, however, a signature is calculated from the private key and a message, that message usually being a transaction. So you don't produce a signature in general that signs everything. You produce, unlike a handwritten signature where I sign Andreas, and that is always what I sign. Instead, a digital signature is specific to one message. So when I sign one transaction or one input in a transaction, I am producing a digital signature, which is a number, that is calculated from that specific message, or rather its hash, and my private key, and can be verified by someone by inputting that specific message and my public key. And they can verify that signature. So every signature is different because the message itself is different. There is another function which is inside the signature algorithm, inside the function that produces the digital signature, there is also a random number. And that is to ensure that the signatures are different. Otherwise, you can break a signature and calculate the private key. So there is a random number in there that is used to produce the signature. That's a bit too much detail. So one private key produces one public key, produces one address, and produces many different signatures, each one specific to one message or transaction, including a degree of randomness. Panagiotis asks, can a numbered private key generate a public key that is anything other than a number? A picture, sound waves, light waves? You can encode a public key in any format you want. Everything in our universe is numbers. It's just a matter of how you visualize it. So an image is also numbers. Sound waves are also numbers. So you could put a public key in an image. In fact, we do that. QR codes that contain Bitcoin addresses, those are images. You could do it in a sound wave. Of course, you could take a public key or address and you could, for example, transmit it in Morse code. Generally speaking, a number can be encoded in a variety of different ways, and information theory tells us that all information, everything in our universe, including our bodies themselves, are effectively numbers. So information is the universal constant. Let's see how things are going in the chat. All right, we've got quite a few people here. Excellent. Let's continue. Robin asks, is it possible for a hacker to embed a code into the software so that when one is interacting with them over the internet, one's private keys could be extracted? Yes, of course. This is called a leak. And people can design software that leaks private keys. This is a common thing that happens with software wallets, and why software wallets that are on internet devices are called hot wallets. And they're hot because they are internet connected and written in software, which means that they can leak the key over the internet. So that's one of the risks with using a software wallet on an internet connected device. In order to avoid that, we use hardware devices instead. I don't think I have one here to show you, but we use hardware wallets. And hardware wallets are USB devices that are designed to generate and store private keys in a very secure way. And they connect to a software wallet in order to process transactions. But when connecting to that software wallet, they connect over a very, very narrow interface. Not the full wide internet, not the full application stack, not a general purpose operating system like Windows or Mac or anything like that, but instead through a very, very narrow protocol that does not leak information that can compromise your private key. Well, here's an example. This is a hardware wallet. This particular hardware wallet is a Trezor hardware wallet. It has a USB-C plug in the bottom, and it has a screen which is a touch-sensitive screen that allows me to confirm transaction signing. Yes, your private keys can be leaked by software that is malicious, Trojan horses, malware, keyloggers, and things like that. A compromised operating system like a Windows or Mac operating system will be compromised by a virus that can extract private keys from the software you're running on it, or even compromised software on your Android phone or iOS phone could leak keys. All of that, of course, can happen, which is why we use hardware wallets to protect our keys. Now, you may have a smartphone wallet and a hardware wallet and keep only a small amount on your smartphone. I do that. I don't put on my smartphone my hot wallets any more than I would have in cash in the back pocket of my pants, in my wallet, when I'm walking down the street. Just normal precaution. Any amount more than that I would keep in a hardware wallet device. We are going to be talking about wallets in next week's presentation in week 4 with a lot more detail so you can understand the difference between hot and cold, web, mobile, and hardware wallets. Generally speaking, it's not enough to simply be offline. Hardware wallets themselves are designed to minimize the software footprint that's on this device. The operating system, the application that runs on this hardware is very, very minimalistic. Simply installing a software wallet on a general purpose operating system like Android or Windows or something like that and keeping it offline is not enough. That does not make it cold storage. It does not make it sufficiently secure, because operating systems, general purpose operating systems, have vulnerabilities and a very, very big exposure to potential vulnerabilities because they have so many applications and code and drivers and things like that. All right, let's move on. Fungi asks, are there any known attacks or attempted attacks for the SHA-256 and RIPEMD-160 hashing algorithms used in Bitcoin transactions? No. There may be some weaknesses in RIPEMD alone, which is why there's a combination of 2 hashing algorithms there. But every hashing algorithm, every cryptographic algorithm eventually becomes vulnerable to attack. It's simply a matter of time as computers get faster, as computers develop new techniques, as the algorithms, the mathematics gets better. Maybe weaknesses are found in the mathematics of the hashing algorithm or in the mathematics of an elliptic curve digital signature or things like that. Cryptography is a moving target. You can't simply implement something and then stay on that standard forever. You have to advance as the technology advances and as our knowledge advances. So right now, SHA-256, RIPEMD, no known attacks that can create things like collisions, which is finding 2 different messages that can be hashed to the same hash, and various other types of attacks against hashing algorithms have been found that are practical in reasonable amounts of time and energy on these algorithms. So nothing to worry about there. Praveen asks, in the presentation, there's a reference that the owner may get some change back for every transaction. Could you please elaborate on this topic? This topic is a bit confusing often for newbies, but Bitcoin transactions are not like bank accounts where you simply have a balance and you update it and say, you know, -$1, +30, -3, etc. Bitcoin transactions are more like a wallet that contains notes of different denominations. Now, let's say you have in your wallet a $10 note, and you want to buy a $6 cup of coffee. It's a very expensive cup of coffee. Well, what do? You have $10. The coffee costs $6. You can't take the $10 and cut 60% of it and give that to the retailer. They're going to look at you as if you're crazy if you try to do that. So instead, what you'll do is you'll give them the $10, which is indivisible, and they'll give you $4 change. Bitcoin transactions work in the same way. You have an amount of Bitcoin that is stored as what's known an unspent transaction output, or UTXO. This is what transactions create. They create these chunks of Bitcoin. And these chunks are denominated in Satoshi. There's some integer value of the Satoshi unit, which is the smallest unit in Bitcoin. So let's say, for example, you have a UTXO that's 100,000 Satoshi, and your cup of coffee costs 60,000 Satoshi. Well, you can't take that 100,000 UTXO and split it. Instead, what you do is you spend it entirely as an input in your transaction, and then your transaction creates 2 outputs. One that pays 60,000 Satoshi for your cup of coffee, and one that pays you back 40,000 Satoshi. So you take 100,000 Satoshi out of your Bitcoin wallet, or effectively you authorize the spending of 100,000 Satoshi unspent transaction output that exists on the blockchain, and then you create two new transaction outputs, one for your coffee shop owner who takes 60,000 Satoshi, and one for yourself that goes back to an address that's controlled by your wallet, that's 40,000 Satoshi. And that's why we have change. You need change because the Bitcoin units themselves are indivisible. You can't consume some of it. Every output of every transaction becomes part of your balance, but you can only consume in terms of whole balances or whole outputs. Here's another example. You might also have to put together several. So let's say, again, in the example of your cup of coffee, let's say you had two $5 notes in your wallet and the coffee costs $6. Well, 5 isn't enough, 10 is too much. So what do? You give both 5s to the coffee shop owner and they give you $4 change. In a Bitcoin transaction, you might have two 50,000 Satoshi UTXO, and what you're trying to buy costs 60,000 Satoshi. Well, one of your UTXO is not enough. You need both. So your transaction will spend both of the 50,000 UTXO to create a total amount of 100,000 Satoshi, and then one output to the coffee shop owner, let's say, for 60,000 Satoshi, and one output of 40,000 Satoshi back to you. And that's how transactions work. Praveen asks, who or what decides the transaction fee? I hear miners generally pick transactions with higher fee when mining new blocks, so who sets the transaction fee? And what happens to the transactions with lower fee that aren't picked up by any miner? Will this ever happen? Yes, Praveen, this does happen. Who picks the transaction fee? You do. When you create a transaction and you send it into the network, you decide how much fee you want to include. And you make that decision based on what you see currently as the average level of fee that will get your transaction confirmed in the next 1 block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks, 10 blocks, 100 blocks. So it depends on how important or how urgent this transaction is for you. If you need it confirmed quickly, you have to put a higher fee to compete against everybody else. If you need it, if you don't need it confirmed quickly, then you can put a lower fee and hope it gets confirmed over several blocks or even sometimes several days. And what happens to transactions that are not picked? They're not picked. They just sit there unconfirmed. And after 3 or 4 days, they basically drop off the network, and you haven't achieved your transaction. The money is always in your wallet. Effectively, you still control the funds until a transaction is confirmed. The funds haven't been spent. But you may have to wait until that transaction drops off the network so you can try it again. So in some wallets, the good wallets, you have the ability to create a new transaction with a higher fee so that you can bump the fee to make your transaction more competitive in this system. It's effectively an auction where you place bids for space in the block based on your transaction fee, competing against other people who are placing bids for space in the block. And this allows users to tell the network how important a transaction is from their own perspective. Because if you simply say everybody gets in, then what happens is users flood the block with transactions that may not be important to them, or it gets used for applications that really don't have economic value. And so in order to avoid that, there is a marketplace. Now think about what happens if you simply allowed all transactions to be added. Now your blocks, if they didn't have a limit, would get bigger and bigger. And in order to approve all of the transactions of all of the users, you would need massive blocks. And that doesn't make the cost of running this thing disappear. It simply moves the cost. Instead of users paying and deciding through their fees how important a transaction is from their own perspective, you effectively have miners and nodes paying to store these massive blocks, to transmit and receive these massive blocks. And as a result, that makes mining and operating a node more and more unaffordable, and fewer people would do it, which centralizes the network. And ultimately what that means is that miners and nodes get to decide which transactions are important, which transactions are legitimate, which transactions are spam. We don't want to give miners, nodes, or developers that kind of power. A marketplace for fees ensures that the decision is made by the actual buyer of this space, which is the user who created the transaction. On a similar note, Darak asks, the current size of the Bitcoin blockchain is about 1 megabyte. It's almost 4 if you count the witness, but yes, somewhere between 1 and 4 megabytes. While cost barriers on memory keep following Moore's law, the replication of the blockchain across multiple nodes over time must present challenges. Exactly. This is exactly the point. Since the blockchain is immutable, meaning that at any given time the current state of the network can be validated by the most recent blocks, is retaining all blocks really necessary, or can earlier blocks be archived or deleted without compromising the network and the cryptocurrency? Yes and no. You can operate a node that validates all transactions and blocks, but doesn't keep all transactions and blocks. Such a node is called a pruned node. And once it's downloaded from the Genesis block a copy of the blockchain, it can throw away all the transactions and not keep them on its hard drive. Such a node, a pruned node, can be pruned down to, I believe the minimum is 500 megabytes. Compared to 345 gigabytes, which is the full size of the blockchain, 500 megabytes is obviously a lot smaller. You're only keeping about a month's worth of blocks and transactions. However, someone has to have the full blockchain in order to help new nodes bootstrap from the Genesis block and be able to validate that they're on the correct chain. This is an important aspect of immutability. If you simply just downloaded the last 10 blocks, then you could very easily be lied to by miners who put in enough hashing to create only the last 10 blocks and effectively put you on the wrong chain or persuade you about a difference in the contents of the blockchain. So the ability to leave and come back, or to start from zero from the Genesis block, is important for the overall validation of the network. So someone has to keep full archival nodes which have the entire blockchain and are also willing to serve it out to other nodes that are bootstrapping for the first time. I run several such archival nodes, and it's expensive. It costs me about $200 to $300 a month in bandwidth costs in order to serve up the full blockchain to new nodes that are bootstrapping the network. And that's part of the expenditure I make. But you don't have to do that, as long as somebody's doing it. All right, let's see what's happening in the chat. Very good. Vakal asks, is cryptography an art or a science? It is a science. It is a branch of mathematics. Cryptography is specifically related very closely to information theory and number theory. So cryptography is a science. It's a part of mathematics. Now, the kinds of applications of cryptography and the interesting recipes that people build with the essential primitive building blocks of cryptography can sometimes seem like more of an art because they require an enormous amount of imagination and creativity to produce these recipes using cryptographic primitives. So there is an artistic element. There's certainly a creative element in applied cryptography. And there is a very big creative element in cryptanalysis because that requires examining cryptography from areas that people have not examined it before. Cryptanalysis, of course, is the process of breaking cryptography by figuring out flaws or weaknesses or shortcuts in the cryptographic systems. All right. The next question comes from 3 different students, all who want to hear about a specific area called a Merkle tree, specific technology that's used extensively in Bitcoin and many other cryptocurrencies and cryptographic systems. Jamie, Daniel, and Praveen all ask, could you please explain the Merkle tree? The Merkle tree is a data structure invented by Ralph Merkle, who is still with us and involved in cryptography and still producing incredible work. So a Merkle tree is a binary tree usually. That means, binary tree means that you have 2 branches at every level. So in computer science, we do our trees upside down. All of our trees are upside down, but you can visualize it any way you want. The root of the tree that we usually draw on the top is 1 node or number. And from there you have 2 branches that go down, and then you have 2 nodes immediately below. It's called a binary tree because you have 2 branches coming out of the root, and then from each of those you have 2 branches, and from each of those you have 2 branches, and so on and so forth. A tree can have as much depth as you want. Again, it's all upside down. You could think of the root at the bottom and then branching up, and you could have as much height as you want, but that's not how we do things in computer science, and I know it is confusing at first. A Merkle tree is a particular type of binary tree that uses hashes and hashing algorithms in order to calculate a summary of all of the information. It's basically a tool for summarizing information in a way that you can prove that something is part of the tree in a very efficient way. So let's start with the bottom. Let's say that we have 16 leaves at the bottom. Leaves are the bottommost nodes that don't have any further branches. They're the end of a branch, right? Leaf, end of branch. So at the bottom we have leaf nodes. Let's say there's 16 in this particular Merkle tree. That means that on the level above there's 8, on the level above there's 4, on the level above there's 2, and then there's finally 1 called the root node. So what happens at each level is a summary of hashes. At the bottom of the leaves we have a hash of some kind. Usually in the case of a Merkle tree in Bitcoin, what we use the Merkle tree to do is summarize transactions. So each leaf is a transaction, or more specifically, it's the hash of a transaction or a transaction ID. The hash or fingerprint of a transaction, which is 256 bits, is stored in the first leaf. And the second leaf has the hash of another transaction. Doesn't matter which order you put them in, just 16 transactions, all as hashes represented as the leaves. So we take the first pair, transaction A and transaction B, and then we concatenate the 2 hashes, 256 bits plus 256 bits, 512 bits, and we feed those into a hashing algorithm to produce the hash of the parent node, which 2 branches go down to these 2 transactions. And we do that for the next 2 transactions to create their parent, and the next 2 transactions to create their parent, and the next 2 transactions to create their parent. Now we've gone from 16 hashes to 8 hashes, but these 8 hashes depend on every bit of the 16 hashes below them. Now if we take these 8 hashes and we take the first 2 and we hash them together, and the third and fourth hash and we hash them together, and the 5th and 6th hash and we hash them together, and the 7th and 8th hash and we hash them together. Now we have 4 hashes. These 4 hashes depend on the 8 hashes below them, which depend on the 16 hashes below them. So we've now summarized 16 to 8 to 4, and we keep going to 2 to 1. Now we have 1 hash. That 1 hash is called the Merkle root. The Merkle root is a hash. It's a 256-bit value, but it depends on every element in the bottom of the tree. It doesn't matter how deep the tree is. You could have billions of leaves that are grouped together all the way up. Now, if you had billions of leaves, how deep would the tree be? because of binary math and because you have double at every level, in fact, it would only be 32 levels deep, which is shocking. The idea that with a 32-level tree, you could summarize 1 billion entries into a single hash. And this is the magic of the Merkle tree. It allows you to summarize vast amounts of information down into a single hash. But there's another trick, which is that if I want to prove that one of those billion elements is part of the tree, I only need to produce a proof that is 32 hashes long to show you how to get down there. So if I wanted to prove to you that element A is part of the tree, well, its hash is added to element B that's next to it to produce its parent. So if you know element A, and I give you the hash of element B, you can calculate its parent. If I then give you the other parent that is hashed together with this one, you can calculate their parent. And if I give you one more at that level, you can calculate its parent all the way up to the root. So at every point in time, all I have to give you is the other hash of the pair up the tree, up the branches. So for 1 billion elements, which are only 32 levels deep, if I give you the 32 pairwise hashes that lead you down a path to the element that you want to check, I can prove to you that this element is summarized in the root. And I did so with only 32 hashes to prove something in a set of 1 billion elements. Well, 4 billion actually, because 32 bits is 4 billion. That's incredible, right? And that's the power of a binary tree. That's the power of a Merkle tree. It's used as a summarizing mechanism. So in Bitcoin, how do we use this? A block has 3,000 transactions. But in order to prove that the transaction is part of a block and to ensure that it is included and recorded into the block, we only put one hash, 256 bits, which is the root of a Merkle tree that includes 3,000 elements at the bottom. And we can prove any transaction is part of that tree by simply giving you just a few hashes to do 3,000 elements, right? So you can do the math on that. I'm not going to try and do it to the top of my head. But you can do just a few hashes. You can prove any one of those 3,500 transactions are part of the Merkle root, have been encoded or summarized in the Merkle root, and therefore they were committed and recorded in the block header, which was then hashed with all of the other information to produce the block header hash, which is recorded in the chain of blocks. So we use hashes to summarize information, transactions into the Merkle tree, the Merkle root into the block header, the entire block header into the block hash, which then is linked to the previous block, etc., etc. All of these things tie everything together and allow us to prove that these things are connected. And you can't change anything, not a single bit in any of that, without a cascade effect. You change one bit in one of the transactions at the bottom of the tree, and that changes two of the hashes, which then ripples up all the way and changes the root, which then changes something that's in the block header, which changes the block header hash, which then breaks the entire chain of the blockchain. So that's how we use Merkle trees. I hope that was a clear explanation. That may have needed a whiteboard for this particular demonstration. All right. No need to worry, the system works well, but what about exchange hacks? Anna asks, in previous questions you have answered that the system works well and there is no need to worry. However, if I was the owner of any of the money lost in the recent two events in 2019, Quadriga CX lost Bitcoin, Binance lost Bitcoin, etc., and also the ones in the past, Bitfinex, Mt. Gox, Antbleed, etc., I would be mad, not only worried. How do you comment? Yes, Bitcoin is a decentralized system of ownership, which means that, very, very importantly, and I have this on mugs, on t-shirts, and in a number of different places, if you have control of your keys, you have control of your Bitcoin. And in order for someone to steal it, they have to come and break into your wallet. All of these hacks that we described, they didn't hack the Bitcoin blockchain. They didn't hack any of the technology of Bitcoin. They hacked the security measures of an exchange that was holding keys on behalf of thousands, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of users. So I am very worried about giving my money to the control of an exchange. I never store money on an exchange. And in fact, I have created a memorable slogan for people to remember this very important principle of decentralized control. Your keys means your coins. As a result, not your keys means not your coins. So when you have money on Quadriga CX or Mt. Gox or Binance, whose money is that? It's not your keys because you do not have the private keys. Binance or Quadriga or Mt. Gox had the private keys. So it's not your coins. You have an IOU. You have a debt obligation from the exchange towards you that they may or may not be able to fulfill. When I have my keys on this device, on this is the hardware wallet I was showing you earlier, when I have my private keys on here, my keys, my coins, my control, my responsibility, and if you want to hack it, you have to get my device out of my cold, dead hands. You have to find me first. It's a lot harder to hack 10 million people in 10 million locations with 10 million hardware wallets with 10 million copies of keys than it is to hack one exchange with 10 million customers that keep all of those keys in one place. And that's why concentration in exchanges is extremely dangerous. Exchanges are not Bitcoin. Exchanges are not cryptocurrency. Exchanges are banks, and they have all of the same risks as banks. Why should the hash value be less than the predetermined target value? This is a question from last chapter from mining. Daniel asks, on the slide the following was mentioned. If the hash of the block header is not less than the target value, the block will be rejected by the network. Finding a block that has a sufficiently small hash value is the proof of work problem. My question, why should the hash value be less than the predetermined target value? Because that's how the network adjusts the difficulty of mining dynamically. Because the target specifies how difficult it is to find a hash. Let me give you an example. Let's assume that mining is like throwing darts, right? And the target that you're throwing the darts is 2 meters wide. And at 2 meters wide, you're going to hit that target. Not a problem. This is easy. You just throw darts and they all hit. And so then the difficulty of this game is adjusted. The target is narrowed. Now it's only 1 meter wide. Now you're throwing darts, and if you were throwing them at random as you were before, which is how hashing works, well, half the darts that were landing before are going to fall outside of the target. Now we take the target and make it 50 centimeters. Now only a quarter of the dart throws you were throwing randomly, let's say you're blindfolded or you're very bad at darts, are actually landing on the dartboard. Now we take it down to 25 centimeters and then 12.5 centimeters and then 6 centimeters and 3 centimeters. Now you're throwing darts and they're mostly hitting the wall. Not many are hitting there. In fact, if you make the target small enough, you will have to throw trillions of darts before one of them hits the target, and that is proof of work. If you show me a target that is so small and it has a dart with your name on it right in that target, and I know you're throwing them at random, I will say, well, if I see a dart with your name on that target and I know how small it is, what I assume is that there are trillions of darts all over the wall, which are all of the ones you missed. And by shrinking that target, I know you've done work. I know because you're throwing randomly, and the only way it could have landed right specifically on that target when it's so small is if you threw a lot of darts. In fact, I can calculate, statistically speaking, how many darts you would have to throw to hit that target, and therefore I know how much work you did. And I can adjust the work. I can make it easier or more difficult by increasing or decreasing the target. And so Bitcoin's mining difficulty is done like that. The number at which you have to get your hash below is like the target dartboard, and as we reduce that, it gets more and more difficult when you're picking hashes at random effectively to go below that target and actually hit it. So you end up having to do a lot of hashing before by accident you find one that reaches that target. If it becomes too difficult and we're not finding blocks often enough, the difficulty target goes up and it gets easier because now there's a bigger target for you to hit. And that's why we say that the hash value must be less than the predetermined target. That allows us to ensure that you've done enough work, because it proves that you've done enough work, because your hashes operate seemingly at random and you cannot predict where the hash will land. It's like throwing darts blindfolded. And so the primary factor that determines your success is the size of the target. I hope that answered that question. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is 51% attacks, and we're going to close with that topic because there are quite a lot of questions on this. This comes from last week's material. We did not get to talking about 51% attacks, and it's very important to understand. 51% attacks. Raphael asks, slide 31 of this week's material, that's last week, states that if one miner controls more than 50% of the hash power, they can produce a longer chain than all of the other miners combined. They could then reverse their own past transactions. They can't spend other people's coins, but they can prevent transactions from being confirmed. With that in mind, how would you assess the risk in the long run? So, the important thing to understand about a 51% attack is that 51% attack requires an enormous expenditure of resource in order to achieve very, very little. In fact, if the motivation of a miner is profit, then there is no scenario in which this is a profitable exercise. If you have that much hashing power, it's better to follow the rules and mine in accordance with the rules. If you use that hashing power to try to cheat, you end up either forking the blockchain or denying service, and you don't actually gain much reward because you push the economic activity away from the network. See, the thing is, if you have 51% of the hashing power, you can't change the rules because you can't force other people on the network to accept blocks that follow a different set of rules. If you produce a block that has more reward for yourself, everybody else will reject it. They'll stop following your hash rate. Remember, the rules of the network are the largest cumulative difficulty valid chain wins. Largest cumulative difficulty is proof of work, is hash rate. Valid chain means that you are looking at a set of consensus rules on your own node and deciding what is and isn't valid. You can have 100% of the hashing power, but if what you're producing is an invalid chain because it has blocks with wrong reward, blocks that are too large, transactions that spend coins without signatures, transactions that try to spend coins that don't exist, transactions that spend more than they consume, transactions with negative amounts, transactions of a huge size, any one of the several dozen rules of consensus. Every node is checking these rules. So having 51% of the hashing power allows you to have the longest cumulative difficulty chain, but it doesn't allow you to make an invalid chain. You still have to make a valid chain. You still have to fulfill all of the rules, which means that the only real thing you can do with a 51% attack is you can deny service. You can refuse to include other people's transactions. You can also effectively go back some distance into the past and start remining the chain from that point in the past in order to exclude or try to double spend transactions that are already considered confirmed. Now, this would be in the economic benefit of, say, an exchange, because if they can reverse transactions where they spent money, that money is no longer spent and somebody else is going to miss out. In order to do that, you not only have to have 51%, you also have to start at a previous point in the history of the chain. And as you mine forward, you're basically remining old blocks. You're spending the electricity again, but you're not really getting a new reward. You're just getting the same reward from those blocks that was previously spent. Now, if you assume that the miners who have 51% now previously had some percentage and previously were participating in the mining, after all, they didn't just come across a few million ASICs out of nowhere, then they have already earned some of this reward. And when they remine those blocks, they're not earning it again. In fact, they're spending the energy twice but earning the reward only once. The old chain disappears, the new chain is the only one. So there's only ever one reward paid for block height. But if you remine from the past, you end up spending the energy twice, which makes it very, very expensive to try to go and change the past. Very, very expensive. And to what point? As soon as an attack like that is shown, most exchanges will shut down their operations, extend their confirmation times, and I would assume that developers would issue a new version of the Bitcoin software that has a checkpoint that removes that remined chain. It depends how big the damage is, really, as to what the social response, what the community response to that is. Consensus isn't just a system of mathematical rules. There's also economic incentives and economic actors who are going to coordinate and act independently. Just because the algorithm says we're going this way doesn't mean that the rest of the network can't go, you know what, they're cheating, and I'm not going to follow that chain. I know it's valid. I know they put the work in, but I don't want to follow that chain. I'm not going to accept any withdrawals or deposits from that chain. And you can, in fact, implement things like that that override algorithmic consensus. Again, this gets very complicated. It's in the politics domain, not the technical domain. The bottom line is this: 51% attacks are very, very expensive. They produce very little benefit. The most likely conceivable reason why someone would run a 51% attack would be if they have no consideration for profit, if they have a very large, near unlimited amount of money they want to throw at this, and they're going to spend several years building up an industrial-sized infrastructure of ASICs, or buying or confiscating ASICs from existing miners, and using that effectively to try to destroy the network. Now, that's a conceivable reason why someone would try to destroy the Bitcoin network. The question then is, could such an attack succeed? I don't think it would. I think ultimately that attack would force a change in the proof of work algorithm. It would force a change in the consensus algorithm in order to prevent the hostile takeover and destruction of the network. And there are a number of alternatives that could be used. At this point, you have a big enough distribution of Bitcoin that you could switch to proof of stake, for example, temporarily or permanently, or switch to a different hashing algorithm, or some hybrid combination, or use a temporary proof of authority algorithm to thwart the attack. The point is that there will be counters. And these counters will likely make such an attack ultimately fail. And if you take, as they say, if you take a shot at the king, try not to miss. Because if you miss, the consequences of missing are worse than not taking a shot at all. So anyone who would try to do this would not only have to spend billions of dollars, probably tens of billions of dollars, maybe up to $100 billion to execute an attack like this, or use a very public and obvious amount of violence and coercion, ultimately to achieve what? Possibly achieve nothing except proving that Bitcoin can survive an attack of that magnitude, which at that moment becomes part of Bitcoin's mythology. If you take a hit at Bitcoin of that magnitude and you fail, you have just validated the entire premise of Bitcoin's survivability. You have proven that Bitcoin can survive even that kind of attack. And that's a very dangerous thing to prove, because at that point it makes it even more appealing to those who want something very, very stable and robust. So 51% attacks are interesting in that they represent a category of theoretical attacks on consensus algorithms that use proof of work based on the longest cumulative difficulty chain. But there is a vast difference between a theoretical and mathematical attack on a specific algorithm and a practical and successful attack on a socially and economically motivated system that uses that algorithm but also has human actors who can act independently and respond to such attacks by doing things that you can't anticipate. So sure, the math says 51% can attack the network. The reality says that such an attack has very little benefit, is very difficult to pull off, and would likely fail. So again, that's why after 12 years, we have not seen something even approaching a successful 51% attack or any kind of consensus attack against Bitcoin. All right, another favorite topic that comes up every time in almost every Q&A. Bitcoin and quantum computers. Will quantum computers destroy Bitcoin? No. Okay, I assume you want a longer answer than that. Giancarlo asks, could a new generation of quantum computers be the end of the Bitcoin blockchain? They could conceivably generate so much hash power to easily perform a 51% attack. So this is one angle. This is a quantum computer used to attack the proof of work algorithm. Now, keep in mind, quantum computers are not magical computers that can break every algorithm out there and break it decisively and completely the first moment someone invents a quantum computer. Quantum computers are computers. They have certain capabilities, and these capabilities have a certain power, if you like, a certain capacity. So a quantum computer's capacity is measured in qubits, which is how many bits of quantum computation can it marshal. Now, current generation quantum computers that we know of are in the range of 10 to 20 qubits. Practical applications in commercial settings don't even reach that high. Now, if you were to assume that there are other magical quantum computers that have advanced the technology much further, perhaps in the hands of intelligence agencies or secretive organizations, yeah, let's double that. Let's say instead of 20 qubits, it's 40. Now, if we look at the history of the development of the power of quantum computers, it's actually getting more and more and more difficult to increase the number of qubits. You can't simply double them and keep doubling them. There is no Moore's law here. If anything, the opposite applies. Instead of it getting easier or doubling with every successive generation, the progress is actually slowing down. So there's no reason to think that if we see commercial computers with 20 qubits, that the magical computer in the background has 1,000 qubits. And how many qubits does it take to break Bitcoin? Well, there are two algorithms here that matter. One algorithm is the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm. And this is basically the mathematics that happen on the elliptic curve, the mathematics that allow you to go from a private key to a public key, but not backwards, and from a private key and a message to a signature, but not backwards. And the but not backwards part is the important part. In a classical computer, in order to go backwards, you would have to try a brute force attack that tries all possible keys. That is both practically impossible from a time perspective and practically impossible from a total amount of energy that you would need impossible. So what about a quantum computer? Well, a quantum computer could do a faster solution to the discrete logarithm problem. The discrete logarithm problem is the going backwards, if you like, on the elliptic curve. Going backwards from a public key and finding the private key would obviously cause some severe damage, and even more so going backwards from a signature to calculate a private key. Now, in order to do that, it's estimated that you would need approximately twice the number of qubits as the elliptic curve field, as far as I know. I may be wrong on this, but in any case, the private keys used here, the elliptic curve we're talking about, is a 256-bit field, which is more than 10 times the size of the current commercial quantum computers. Nowhere near possible to do reversing of a discrete logarithm problem with a quantum computer. For a hash algorithm, which is the other category, we don't even have a good function or mathematical solution that we can apply. So you need a quantum algorithm in order to reverse a classical computer calculation, and there are no really good quantum algorithms. Unlike discrete logarithm problem, where factorization in quantum computers has been extensively studied and is easy to do, doing so with a hash algorithm involves a lot more, what looks like a lot more like brute forcing. It's just done in a quantum domain. It's estimated you might need as much as 2,000 bits, 2,000 qubits, in order to break SHA-256. So again, 2 orders of magnitude more than what we currently have. So to break hashing in Bitcoin, 2 orders of magnitude. To break signatures and public keys, 1 order of magnitude. And in both of those cases, we are nowhere near getting that level of quantum computing. What can we do in the meantime? Well, if you have broad availability of quantum computers, even with lower levels of qubits, then I could have a quantum computer chip or USB stick in my laptop or in my hardware wallet, and I could use that to apply a new type of digital signature algorithm. Not the elliptic curve digital signature algorithm, but a quantum digital signature algorithm, which is as resistant to quantum analysis as a classical algorithm is to classical analysis. Meaning, if you can crack classical signatures with quantum computers, you can't crack quantum signatures with quantum computers. There are quantum algorithms. There are quantum computing or quantum computing resistant digital signature algorithms, and these are developed gradually. So if everyone has one, then we simply both sign and produce proof of work with quantum computers, and then the level playing field is back again. If only some organizations have one, then the question is how much better or faster is it than everybody else's, and that's where things get more difficult. If we see symptoms that indicate that quantum computing has progressed much faster than expected, there are ways to introduce new digital signature algorithms in Bitcoin. In fact, we're about to do one in 2021. In 2021, there is an upgrade planned for Bitcoin called Taproot, and Taproot includes a system called Schnorr signatures. Now, this is a completely different signing mechanism than ECDSA. And all that demonstrates is Schnorr signatures are not better for quantum computers, but what they demonstrate is you don't have to just have one signing mechanism. You can have elliptic curve digital signature algorithm and Schnorr signatures running in parallel on the same blockchain. In fact, you could have dozens and dozens and dozens of signature algorithms, and you could upgrade them as needed. The more difficult thing is the logistics and practical aspect of moving funds that are currently locked under ECDSA to some future signature algorithm that is protected against quantum computers. And that's a logistical exercise. It's a quite significant logistical exercise. Everybody would need to have the software that allows you to create the new types of signatures and addresses, and then you would have to basically spend from the old signature type and lock it in the new signature type, and then your funds are protected. And of course, anybody who gets left behind is vulnerable to theft by a quantum computer as and when those quantum computers are used to attack the system. Bottom line, very often when people come into Bitcoin and blockchains and cryptography in general, because of the complexity of the mathematics, the balance of incentives, the complex strategic and political games that are happening, the many different constituencies and involved organizations and the economics of all of that, it's often not clear how all of this plays together. And while it seems robust from the outside, you don't want to take anybody's word for it. You don't want to say, well, everybody says it can't be broken, so therefore it can't be broken. That's not good science. So you start asking questions, and that's good. You have to be skeptical. What happens then is many people go down this journey where they start with, okay, there must be a catch. There must be a reason that this won't work. It's too good to be true. There must be a catch. There is a way to break this. And as they start reading, they find all of these articles, peer-reviewed journal entries, etc., which discuss various, often academic and theoretical attacks that could be used on different parts of the system or different elements of the system, different incentive systems. And they grab each one of these and say, aha! This is how you break Bitcoin. It's 51% attacks, it's too much environmental damage, or it's quantum computing, or it's the governments ban it, or it's regulated out of existence, or the governments make a better version, or Facebook makes a better version, etc., etc. And over time, you go through all of these reasons and you gradually figure out why attacking any one part of the system doesn't actually break the system, because it's a system that has multiple layers of security and multiple checks and balances that balance each other out. So you break it over here and the balance tips a bit, but it doesn't fall over because there's other mechanisms to protect. As you go through these, you may decide, okay, I'm now gaining confidence. This system hasn't been broken for 12 years, but also I can see how each one of these attacks on its own doesn't do anything. And even if you try to combine them, it's not quite clear who and how would be able to coordinate such a massive attack. So yes, quantum computers are a theoretical attack against one part of Bitcoin. And if we didn't change that part and we sat around waiting for an attack and someone coordinated it with perfect coordination and perfect secrecy and launched it all at once, yes, it would cause untold damage to Bitcoin. But we're not going to wait around. We're not going to stand still. And we're not going to just let them do that. And at the same time, they're not going to be able to coordinate this and do it in utmost secrecy and do it all at once and do it with absolute success. Because these are real systems which involve real adversarial powers. The same thing with the 51% attack. Yes, in theory, a perfectly executed 51% attack would severely damage the ability of Bitcoin to continue. If nobody did anything about it, everybody stood still, we didn't change anything, we didn't try to coordinate against such an attack, and the attack was executed very fast, very secretly, very effectively, with no leaks and no failures. But that's not how the real world works. These are real world systems. And so as you go through this, I'm quite happy to answer all of the various questions as to, and what if this happens, and what if that happens? But in the back of your minds, start thinking about another aspect of this, which is, why haven't these attacks happened? And why do many people feel confident putting $1 trillion into a system that, from what I'm reading in this article or that article, seems to have a fatal flaw? Are they all idiots? Maybe. Or maybe they understand that these attacks, while theoretical, are not so easy to pull off in practice. All right, that concludes our third week of the massive open online course 15th semester for the master's degree of the University of Nicosia's Digital Currency Program. And I'm your teacher, Andreas Antonopoulos. I will be back next week, week 4. We're talking about wallets and the various forms wallets take. We'll talk about software wallets, hardware wallets, paper wallets, web wallets, mobile wallets, desktop wallets, and hierarchical deterministic wallets, and everything in between. Ask lots of questions in the forums. And I will be back next Thursday to answer your questions right here. Thank you so much. See you soon.